Where is my mind? Is my mind in my head, or is my mind in my heart? Is it in my belly? Where do I think I exist in my own body?
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy in a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Where is your mind? Where do you experience joy, love, anxiety, and trauma? And where can you experience healing? These are some of the questions posed by today's guest, the somatic psychotherapist Laura Northrup. And what's more, she has answers. The answers come in the form of practice, focus, and self-respect, with the option of a little entheogenic assistance. In somatic psychotherapy, the body is seen as a place to process trauma and a place to emphasize the awareness of our physical embodiment as a way to live a healthier and more fulfilling life. If you keep in touch with how you feel physically, then emotional and spiritual well-being will follow. This is a powerful conversation which couldn't come at a better time because it's so important that we take care of ourselves right now. Laura has some great practical advice about the power of meditation, psychedelics, and bodily awareness. So let's put aside our mind-body duality for a few minutes and enjoy this conversation with Laura Northrup. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to have the therapist Laura May Northrup on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Lex.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you about was a couple of definitions, because you got a master's degree in somatic psychology. And so can you define what that means for us?
Yeah, so it's a pretty big field, but I would say that one of the main sort of tenets of the field is that the body is inseparable from the mind, the spirit. So when we're doing healing work, the body is a really big part of doing that healing work. And then within the field of somatic psychology, there's a lot of different ways people approach that. And I would say that two of the kind of big distinctions I see is people using somatic work to actually process. So there's actually something being processed in the body, like trauma is being processed, wounding is being processed, versus looking at the body as kind of a source of information and actually just living in your body so that you're living a full life and you're aware of how you feel and things like that.
That's interesting that it's both a place to get work done and also a place to learn from. What was it like to study that and get to know those two different ideas?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I feel like a much more embodied person because I studied that. Obviously, it's very important to me, but the degree to which you can get into your body is so much more. Or what I want to say is, I think a lot of times, in fact, I experience this a lot, where I'll invite somebody to feel into their body, or, just in the world talking to people where there's sort of this like 30-second, maybe even less than 30 seconds check-in, just kind of a like half a second, like, oh yeah, I feel fine, as opposed to really spending a lot of focused attention on what is actually going on inside of me. And when I find out what's going on inside of me, what does that mean to me? And so I think for people who don't live in their bodies, there's a world of knowledge happening, and awareness that's so far beyond what I had ever even really imagined before I started getting interested in the work. And so definitely I got a lot of healing just by studying it. But I also started to understand, I think, people in the world a lot differently. And I can say a little bit more about sort of the awareness versus the processing part. And I think we can get into this around psychedelics and entheogens and sort of the connection between somatic ideas and what I think psychedelics and entheogens can really do for the body. But so, when we talk about being aware of the body or being in the body, a lot of that, if you've ever studied Buddhist theory or practiced meditation, a lot of it is really, really similar, and I think a lot of somatic psychology is really informed by Buddhist spirituality. And then when we talk about expressing in the body, and processing. And when I say processing, I think expressing is a part of processing. That gets more into a realm of thinking about trauma and thinking through, every kind of field of therapy or field or modality of healing has some type of theory that they're working with on what's actually healing. And across cultures, we have a lot of different ideas about what's healing. Some people think healing is just having an insight. So I'm aware that I'm upset about something, kind of on a mind level, and then therefore that is healing. In the somatic psychology realm, the idea is that something actually has to be processed on the physical level for healing and change to happen. And what that can look like is processing that's like shaking, crying, different types of breathing, anything that I would say really is a lot about expressing. And I could get way deep into why I think expression is important, but, feelings want to be expressed. That's really a belief that I have. Feelings want to be expressed, and the body is, we are our bodies. Like, our bodies do our expression.
Those are great ideas. One thing I've heard a good bit is about trauma being stored in the body. And so I wonder if you could talk about that and how that comes out in expression and how it might get processed in the body.
Sure. So this is a great question, and I like to kind of point out whenever we talk about ideas or theories or any way of thinking that we're just humans trying to understand ourselves and categorize ourselves. And so, for example, when we give somebody a diagnosis like generalized anxiety disorder, for example, which is a really common diagnosis, that's just like people observing themselves and other people and grouping together a certain set of behaviors or symptoms and calling it a thing. So we're like making this up as we go along is kind of what I want to say. So in terms of this question of like, when people say trauma's stored in the body, in a sense, that statement is coming out of a system of thinking where we don't really think of our bodies as ourselves. So if you are a being and you're a bodied being, every I would say every aspect of you stores the trauma. And you could explain that with kind of science, or I'm putting air quotes in the air, whatever science, I'm sure, has an explanation for that. I think you could also explain it from a spiritual perspective or a magical perspective. But one sort of theory is that when something traumatic happens, your nervous system responds instantaneously. And it wants to do something to protect you. That could be fighting. It could be running away. It could be that your impulse is to try to soothe the person that might be attacking you or a threat to you. And it could be going just completely numb and collapsing. And when your nervous system starts to do that, there may be, for example, like you want to raise your arm to kind of like block something that's coming in your direction, like maybe somebody is trying to hit you. But in that very, very short period where your body says, raise your arm to protect yourself, something else may occur, like that you may go to raise your arm to protect yourself, but the person hitting you is somebody who is also someone you would depend on for love and affection, and you don't want to show that you're afraid of them. You also don't want to do anything that breaks the relationship. It could be that your body says block the hit, but your body says right away after that, no, actually, you can't block the hit. You just need to dissociate because you're not going to live through this. So there's all this energy that surges in your nervous system, all this energy in your body to create the movement to block the hit. But when that energy doesn't actually cycle through, so this is a big, I've studied sensory motor psychotherapy, and this is a big idea in sensory motor therapy, which is that the energy that's moving through your body actually has to sequence all the way out. So you have to make the full hit. And then afterwards, and for people listening, anyone who's maybe been in a car accident or been in a fight or been in any kind of experience that's really traumatic, where afterwards you're shaking, and this is a big idea in the somatics world, that shaking is the energy of your nervous system sequencing through all this, basically all this energy that came through. And a lot of times what happens is we don't do that. So in certain situations, like I said, you don't want to show that you're afraid, you get completely dissociated, or just the culture that we're living in, you know, it's frightening when someone's shaking. And a lot of times if someone else is there trying to support you, they don't want you to shake, you might not feel okay shaking. So all of this is to say, when you don't fully sequence the experience at the time, the idea is that it stays inside of you.
It plays off something that I learned from my wife about Peter Levine's work with animals, where he doesn't see this like long-term stress in animals like we do in people, even though a deer might just barely escape getting eaten by a wolf. And Peter Levine noticed that when animals experience extreme stress like that, once they were safe, they would shake it out, just like you were talking about. And it was an integral part of the process. So it makes a lot of sense that you're saying this as well for the more complicated situations that humans get into.
Yes, absolutely. And Peter Levine is, him and a number of other people are kind of at the core of sort of popularizing this idea at least in the United States, and probably globally too. But yes, for sure. And so that can create, in this sort of theory of somatic theory, it can create pain at the source. So for example, let's just use that example of someone moving their arm up to block. A pain can exist in the shoulder or in that general area where there was all this energy. And some people think that pain, like chronic pain in joints, is a site where movement was truncated. So a movement wanted to happen really quickly and started and stopped. And then, just like chronic anxiety is, to some degree, some people also think chronic anxiety or chronic sort of, the word I want to use actually is activation, because your body gets really activated when it wants to protect itself. That is also sort of a common way of just seeing how on the daily trauma is stored in the body.
Those are great definitions. I have just one more I wanted to ask, and it's about the word embodiment, because it's one that I hear a lot and I've heard you use, but I'm one of those classics where, it's all up in the brain, and then there's that meat sack that's carrying around my brain, and, you don't know what's going on there. And it's kind of the classic problem in a lot of the West today. And so can you talk about what being embodied means to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love that you're outing yourself like that. The meat sack with the brain. I think a lot of people feel that way.
Classic. I don't even feel special.
People really feel that way. And I mean, I think I used to feel that way, right? Like, you're like, what happened when you went to, grad school for somatic psychotherapy? I don't know. I got in my body. I was like, whoa, I mean, I obviously was interested in it, and I still didn't even understand how much more I could be in it. So to me, embodiment, like actually just before I got on this call with you, I took a walk this morning. And as I was walking, I was thinking about, where is my mind? Is my mind in my head, or is my mind in my heart? Is it in my belly? Kind of where do I think I exist in my own body? And I was thinking about it because I was listening to a talk by Spring Washam, where she was telling kind of a story about monks working with researchers who were putting all of these monitors on their brains and then monitoring them while they're meditating. And the monks laughed at the researchers, and the researchers were like, "Why are you laughing at us?" And they were like, "Because the mind is here." And they were pointed to the heart. And so it's kind of like walking along thinking about this and just kind of taking stock of how grateful I am that I actually can feel my body. So when I say embodied, I mean, it's not that hard for me. And I try to live in this place, but obviously we live in a world that really disconnects us from our bodies. But I try to live in the place where I'm just aware of what's going on. I can feel my joints. I can feel my nervous system. And your nervous system has three very large sort of, what's the word I want to use? Like large portions of your nervous system all together, and that is in your intestines and your guts, in your heart, and in your head. And the head is the brain, obviously, where we talk a lot, where we focus a lot, that we think that's where we think, but we really think so much with our heart and our guts too. And I'm big into intuition and, gut feelings, which we only know what those are if we're listening to our body. And the other thing I'll say is, like, we're very influenced by how our body feels anyways. So there's sort of, do you want to consciously engage with it or just sort of let it unconsciously run the show? So that's kind of that's what embodiment means to me, is just like really being in the body. And I'll also say there's a lot of really great reasons not to be in the body, right? Like, most trauma survivors don't want to live in the body because the body is uncomfortable. The body is the place where you're like, I'm full of fear, or I have so much rage and anger, or there's grief. And as soon as I start feeling my body, I have to feel all that stuff. So there's a really good reason why we can disconnect and kind of live in our heads. I also think there's a lot of merit to, if people are interested in it, and nobody has to do this work, like we're allowed to just live however, but like, I think there's a lot of merit and a lot of growth and a lot of joy that can actually come from processing what's in the body, living in the body, and just moving from that place.
So for people listening, what would you recommend that they could do today to deepen their connection to their body, who are intrigued by what you're talking about?
Well, this is great that you're asking this question, because I'm a really big proponent of meditation. I mentioned Spring Washam earlier. I think she's just a lovely, lovely, lovely person. And she's a meditation teacher, Buddhist meditation teacher. And so I'm a big fan of meditation. But what I will say about being in your body is, if you are a very, a trauma survivor, or really just really severe wounding, or, for any reason, you don't want to be in your body, you can just start with breathing. You can just really start with noticing, even if all you notice is, oh, wow, this is what it feels like when the air comes into my nose. I can feel it, and it's coming into my lungs. And then this is what it feels like to exhale. And that alone is like, you don't have to feel the whole body yet. You can kind of feel little parts. And even if that feels inaccessible or too activating, you can also just do a sort of like a meditation where just noticing what you're hearing. And it's like, I'm just like, work at the edge of what makes sense. If it's intolerable to do one thing, do the thing right next to it, and kind of build your way. And so, just even noticing your surroundings and noticing what you see, noticing what you hear, and really being present with it, that's actually a step towards embodiment. So I would say do that.
So I wanted to move on to entheogens and psychedelics. And just for definition's sake, most people would include MDMA with the classic psychedelics when they're talking about these things. And so one of the specialties that you have studied and know about is people who have been using entheogens and psychedelics to heal sexual trauma. And you even host those stories on your podcast, Inside Eyes, where people share their own stories about using these entheogens for that kind of personal therapy. So how did you first start to move in this direction?
Yeah, so I specialize in working with sexual trauma as a psychotherapist. And it's also just been something that I've done activism around. Like, it's a big sort of part of my life path, is to really support people in healing. And I just, I used to teach about working with sexual violence from more of like a psychodynamic perspective, a relational perspective, really thinking about it politically. And there's just this place that people who have experienced severe trauma and sexual trauma, I would categorize in there, as a lot of it is very severe, where people just plateau in regular therapy. And I don't think I wanted that to be the case. I really wanted to believe that regular sort of the therapy I did, or somatic therapy, was enough. And so there was definitely a reckoning that I had to kind of come to around that. And I think there's a lot of ways to heal. I'm not going to say entheogens and psychedelics are the only way to heal. There are so many ways to heal. But I was noticing that in the realm of sort of psychotherapy and in the path I had taken, that there was just a plateau. And people could learn to say no. They could learn to choose to be around people who are treating them better. They could, overcome addictions. But there was just sort of this place where the trauma just wouldn't move. And so I started to get interested in how people are using entheogens and psychedelics because I know people are moving it. And that's where I start thinking really about sexual trauma, not just as like it's a trauma in the body, but that it's a trauma in your soul. And for people to kind of vibe with what I'm saying, you basically have to also accept this idea, or at least entertain this idea that we have a soul, or that we are spiritual beings. And I definitely think that. And yeah, I just, I often say, I really think sexual trauma crushes the spirit. And I don't have a lot of words to describe why it's so spiritually impactful, except to say that I think we're spiritual beings, and I sort of see it happening on this level that's really kind of intangible to describe with the words that we use as humans. And psychedelics and entheogens, so different ones do different things, obviously, right? There's a lot in that category. But what they do is they really get people in their bodies, a lot of them, especially entheogens, really get people in their bodies. And I actually think that they can do healing on a soul level. And that, one of the big things that people talk about in studies with psychedelics is trying to measure what they're calling like a mystical experience or spiritual experience, and trying to understand kind of why does that heal people, or why is that mystical experience so important. And I'm kind of in the category where I don't really feel a need to explain it, but except to say it is just so important. And so that soul level healing plus, and this is sort of tied into what we were just talking about processing trauma. People often take entheogens and they do all that processing. They shake, they cry, they breathe really intensely. They move around in ways that are very, might seem random, but are actually them reprocessing something that's actually happened to them, and doing that physical movement and sequencing that we try so hard to get someone to do in a therapy setting. But I think there's a lot of things about the container and about entheogens and psychedelics that make people more able to do it when they're in that altered state. Certainly in psychotherapy, there's a lot of shame about the body moving around. People don't want to sit there and shake in front of you. But there is something about kind of like, hey, you're going in, you're doing this altered state experience, and you can really, anything is okay. Any part of your experience is okay. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of times with entheogens and psychedelics, you don't really have a choice. It's not like you're going to stop shaking. The entheogen is just going to kind of push you through it. So that's sort of the connection that I see, and why it's so essential to, not essential, but why it's one really powerful way to work with sexual trauma.
I really appreciate your angle because you've captured and shared so many people's stories. And I think it's perhaps the best way to truly study and start to understand this, more than a checklist of what constitutes a mystical experience. And so it sounds like you're talking about healing happening at the body level, at a mental level, and also at a spiritual level. And I was wondering if you see that having different importance in different people's cases, where some people it's more a very much body thing and others a very much spiritual thing, and if that kind of waxes and wanes between the different stories you've heard.
Yeah, I do think that each of us is different, and that there's so much complexity to why something was traumatic, or why it was traumatic in a certain way. And I think that, for example, and I also think we heal different versions or different sort of elements of our wounding at different times in our lives. With something that's a severe trauma, there's no kind of getting over it. There's like finding a way to build a relationship to it. So, taking, for example, maybe somebody was sexually abused as a child, and let's say that they told someone about it, and then that person didn't believe them. Or let's say that person believed them but didn't protect them. That's not just the trauma of the actual sexual violence. It's also the trauma of not being protected. It's the trauma of neglect. It's the trauma of not being believed. It's the trauma of my voice doesn't matter. I have no power. It's another level of powerlessness. So all of those things are going to mean that there's many sort of diverse layers of what needs to happen in the healing. Like there's something that needs to be healed around the trauma, the sort of initial part of it, but there's also something that needs to be healed around the profound lack of trust in humanity that this child has told someone, and that person just straight up doesn't believe them. And that also kind of ties into like, not every sort of experience in our life has to be traumatic, and not every experience is equally traumatic. And how people respond to a traumatic experience is a big part of what shapes the type of trauma that happens. And so, yes, I think that there's a lot of different ways people can be traumatized. I think for some people, getting into their body is really, really essential. And for other people, the spiritual work is essential. For other people, going in and healing their ancestral lineage is really important. For people who are kind of seeing their trauma, and especially with sexual trauma that happens in families, that the lineage of it throughout generations, and even into the dead and the recent dead and ancestors, people might be healing in that way. So yeah, I think there's a lot of variation. And in that way, I would just say to anyone who's listening, that one of the things about my podcast that I really appreciated and enjoyed kind of doing is just creating a lot of different stories. And you can sort of learn from them. You can resonate with them. You can be like, this one doesn't resonate with me, because we're so complex and unique, and we're also really similar. And just to like know that just because you aren't hearing your story exactly right now, or you're hearing one person did it a certain way, that it's okay if that's not the way that you end up doing it.
All of us mammals share an endocannabinoid system. That's why you hear so many stories of people using CBD-rich hemp extracts for their pets. It works for dogs, it works for cats, it works for all of us. For the Plus CBD line of pet products, we only made a few tweaks between what we give to us humans and what we give to our animal friends. It's still full-spectrum hemp extract with all of the rich fatty acids, terpenes, and minor cannabinoids that help the CBD to work better. It's still made with the highest quality to produce the most reliable hemp extracts on Earth. The only difference is that we adjusted the flavor palette to make it easier to give to your dog or to your cat. With flavors like chicken, beef, peanut butter, and salmon, it's easy to drop it into their food and allow them to enjoy the healthful benefits of CBD. Try Plus CBD's pet products today by using the coupon code Lex Files at pluscbd.com for 25% off. Give your pets the gift of health. That's Lex Files at pluscbd.com. I'm curious about how you gathered those stories and what it was like for you to do that work.
Yeah. Well, so the way that I made that podcast is that so what happened is that I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to interview a few people. I was like, I'm going to interview like 3, 4, turned into 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It kind of kept going. But I was like, I'm just going to make a couple of these things and throw them on my website and just kind of be like, here's the place people can just kind of listen to a little library of stories. And then like it just started developing. And I was like, wait, actually there needs to be an episode on this. And if you listen to it, it's a series. So it really starts out with an introduction into the theory. It goes into questions around access in the second episode about like, can you actually even access this stuff and why and what's going on? Then it goes into a whole bunch of interviews that are one-on-one personal interviews with people who have experienced sexual trauma and use psychedelics and entheogens. And then it has a couple of an interview about harm reduction. And then I did a final interview that's about how people actually experience sexual valence in spaces where they're going to get healing with psychedelics and entheogens, because that's a huge issue. And so it really developed from what I was originally going to do. But I recorded almost every interview and edited it before any of them ever started releasing. And I did that because I wanted to have a pretty strong sense of what the series was going to be and really kind of shape it before putting it out there. And the other reason I did that is because the interviews are actually very heavily edited, and there's a lot of work that goes into each of them. And so it's not like I could just kind of slap it together each week and release another episode. It's really like, it took so much to make them. But so because of that, pretty much everybody on the podcast, except I think maybe one person, had never heard the podcast before they did their interview. And it is a lot to ask people to be that vulnerable when they've never met you and they've never heard, they're telling you their story, and you're going to put it out there. And a lot of them didn't get to listen to their interviews before I put it out. Some people wanted to, but for the most part, most people didn't. And so, yeah, it was a really emotionally intense experience for me. And I'm sure for the people who I interviewed too. And I am so, so grateful to all of them because, I think the ability to share their stories, I know for a lot of them, it was really healing. And also I know that many people have gotten a lot out of hearing their stories. And yeah, it was just a very intense process. And for me also, like, I'm a psychotherapist. I listen to trauma and pain all week long, and I would then do this editing on the weekends. And the interviews would also be, these are not like I'm sitting there for, 45 minutes with somebody. It's like I'm meeting them. I'm spending a lot of time with them. I'm talking with them. We're doing the interviews are all shortened. So a lot of conversation, a lot of, talking afterwards. Like I didn't want anyone to be traumatized by the experience. So it was a lot. Yeah.
I want to say thank you for it because it is really important work. I think it's surely changed more lives than you will ever get to see, which is one of the nice parts about doing work like this. But I did want to know, as I was listening to some of them and just knowing that you work as a therapist with this particularly hard specialties, what do you do to help protect yourself or ground yourself or clear yourself from these really incredibly brutal stories that you witness a lot of the time?
That is such a good question. Well, I can say that, when I first started out as a therapist, I really didn't understand how much it was impacting me. And I think I had all kinds of weird coping mechanisms that I don't have to get into in a public space, but just like I wasn't necessarily always good to myself. And I think I would get overwhelmed and feel pretty stressed out. And pretty quickly, I was like, okay, this has got to change. Like, this is not sustainable if I want to be doing this for the rest of my life, which I do. So one thing is that I'm in regular therapy, which is really, really helpful. And the path of being a healing practitioner, and ironically, I'm actually writing a book about being a healing practitioner right now. But so the path of being a healing practitioner, if you're going to work with really heavy material, it really requires you to heal. Like a big part of what you have to be doing is healing. So somebody tells you something that brings up your own material, you really don't have a choice. You have to heal. I mean, you have a choice about how you heal or how quickly you heal, but like it's your body, your being, your spirit is your instrument. And so like you need to hone your instrument. You need to keep your instrument clean and sharp. And so one thing I think is, I really try to decrease my stress in my life. I have had to become a lot more mindful about what I'm doing when I'm not at work. And then I think the biggest thing that I will say is that I have a spiritual practice. It's almost kind of sounds, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but I just really ground into how much the earth and a larger sense of spirit is holding me. And when I say spirit, I don't mean like one, kind of God dude in the sky. I mean like all kinds of spirits. My ancestors are holding me, both the my ancestors of blood and also my ancestors in terms of just the lineage of psychotherapy and just all kind of, I really think about it like all the healing practitioners, all of the ancestral healing practitioners out there holding our work. And I think there's such a vast level of support in the realm of spirit and in the realm of earth and in the realm of colleagues and, people who are alive right now, that is so important to tap into if you're going to be doing this work. And it's just not realistic to say, one single human being who is totally limited, I'm going to go into this world, listen to horrible, horrible things and be okay. That's just not real. Like, you're a being, you're going to be impacted. And especially if you're like an empathic embodied being, you're going to be impacted. So that stuff. And then I also I am like on it in terms of like hiking, connecting to plants, being out in nature. To me, like a really awesome vacation or time away from my clinical work is being out in the middle of nowhere with no phone and just being more connected to plants, really.
Amen. It's a great explanation. And I wanted to ask you for more advice for the people who are listening who are curious about what you're saying about healing with entheogens and perhaps healing deep trauma in themselves, or they're thinking of a loved one. What advice would you have for someone who is intrigued by what you're talking about, especially in the light of the legality of most of these substances?
Yeah. Okay. So, legality. I'll answer that one in a second. So I am really into preparation. And I know that a lot of people, when they say, integration, which is sort of a hot term in this world, that they mean preparation as a part of the integration. But I love to highlight preparation. And I like to highlight it because there's just this, and I'll position myself too. I'm in the United States, I'm surrounded by a culture where the dominant culture is just like, can we just take a pill for our feelings? Like, we just want to put a pill inside ourselves and not feel anymore. And entheogens and psychedelics are not a magic pill. They are really deep, intense, powerful tools. And the more that you prepare, the more you will get out of them. And I say that just, anecdotally, I can say there are a lot of people who use these medicines and don't do any prep work or any integration work afterwards and don't get as much out of it. And I'm like, don't waste your don't not even waste your precious time. Just like, I want to say to people, like, honor yourself and honor the medicine. Like, it's like, show up ready to respect yourself and what you actually need, and show up ready to respect that medicine that is offering you so much. And so in terms of preparation, just because you heard about this and it seems like a good idea, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to rush into it. Like, maybe the preparation is that you're going to do a year of therapy first. Maybe the preparation is that you actually need to make some big changes in your life. Like, maybe you need to leave your job and get a new job. Maybe you need to end a relationship you're in. There's just a lot of things that we kind of hope the psychedelics and entheogens are going to like take care of, but we're not actually going to have to change. Healing is really uncomfortable. Transformation is actually really painful. And so I'm like, prep yourself. Like, building a meditation practice is a great example of something that you could do right now if you're thinking about doing any entheogens or psychedelics in months or weeks or even a year. And part of that is because once you're in there, I mean, especially if you're doing high dose work, it is so intense. And being able to kind of ground yourself, like having a lot of personal ego strength, is very important. And then the other thing I would say is do a lot of research and be mindful. If you're going in to heal trauma, you want to make sure the research you're doing is people actually talking about healing trauma. So like if you go on YouTube and you click in like, high dose mushroom journey or something, and people are like talking about how amazing it was, and it was the first time they ever did it, and they just came off their experience and they're vlogging or whatever, know that like that person might not have some severe trauma history. And so like maybe they can just kind of go off and like take a bunch of drugs at a party and have an amazing experience and they're fine. And for you, it might be actually re-traumatizing. So you can be re-traumatized by these experiences. And I talk a bit about that in the podcast. Yeah. And then I'll just pause on that. And then for the legality issue, I just am like, can we just decriminalize substances like drugs like right now? Especially during COVID, I already have a problem with the drug war. I think it's racist. I think it's classist. I'm definitely like, I'm a big proponent of decriminalizing all drugs. I do not think that drugs are a criminal issue. But during COVID, I'm just like, we are wounded. We are so wounded and we need healing. And that is a crime. Like it is a crime to make these things illegal. So I'll just say that. And in terms of how people can access them, it can be really hard. It can be really, really hard. And I would just say, just because you got access doesn't mean it's the right medicine for you and doesn't mean it's the right guide for you. So really do your research. Like if you find out about somebody who's like a mushroom guide and, it's the only person and you're really, really afraid you won't be able to find anyone else, but that person is giving you a really uncomfortable feeling inside, do not work with them. This is sacred work, and it's better to wait and not be re-traumatized by working with somebody who is out of integrity. And with that, I'll say, there's also a lot of people who do things like what's called trip sitting, where they let a friend sit for them and they do kind of work on their own. And then some people do work totally solo, where they're just by themselves. And I would say for most trauma survivors, that's probably not a good idea. Just harm reduction style, like I think it can make people feel really alone. But if you are somebody who wants to do that, I would just say, like let someone else know what you're doing, basically have a safety plan. So that's what I have to say on the legal issues.
Great. Thank you so much for that. It's exactly what I think people need to hear, especially about re-traumatization and about having, I think, a real therapist who's been trained. I've seen some stories around my circles where it was somebody with a severe PTSD and they just had friends sitting for them, and it just made everything so much worse for a year or two. Almost completely destroyed a life in one case. And this isn't just the happy medicine that people do around each other. When it's severe trauma, you need someone who's been trained in trauma. And I didn't realize how much training, regular psychotherapy isn't necessarily a training for trauma. Within psychotherapy, there's specific trainings for trauma, like the work you did, I believe, which is related to the Hakomi method, the sensory motor and Hakomi and somatic experiencing are all, it's like a bunch of people who all knew each other who made their own lineages. So yeah, they're very related. And I would also just jump in and say, yes, I think having someone who's highly trained, I think having a therapist is a great idea. And I also just want to say, like, psychotherapy is a really particular, professionalized, sort of legitimized way of doing work. I really respect that there are other lineages of people. Like, just even like ayahuasqueros, like I really, really respect that there are other ways to be doing very, very deep trauma work. So I don't want to put down and say, like, I know a lot of people are like, somebody needs to have a master's degree or a PsyD to be qualified to like assist someone in a guided journey. And I'm like, no, like that is so weird and elitist. However, in any lineage where somebody is working with trauma, they have a lot of experience. And I think they need to have a lot of experience. So, and that's the big thing I would say, is just that somebody is really well trained in whatever way they're practicing. And I agree, working with trauma is very different than
sort of like the general run-of-the-mill sort of psychology training. And I really encourage anybody who goes into the field to get an additional trauma training, not just kind of rely on what they learned in grad school.
Amen. And thank you for that. It's a very good point that it's more someone who's trained and practiced in whatever tradition they're doing. Because you're right, it's very elitist. Some of these therapists that you meet, Huxley has that great line about many therapists get into this because of their own dark icebergs. And you even look at the playlists that some of these research programs are using, and they're terrible. And it's just, it's not to say it's just one tradition that's going to have the answer here, but that it's something to really, I appreciate how much you're saying to take it seriously and to put in the work ahead of time and afterwards.
Yeah. And, sometimes you just go out and you do something like you take drugs with friends and it ends up being really healing. And that's so awesome. Other times you go out, you take drugs with friends, you have a total freak out. It's not healing. Like, it's not that it's not possible to get some healing, but I just think it's like, if you're going in to work on serious trauma and that's what you're going to do, like, really put the effort in to take care of yourself. And in a sense, that caring for yourself is also, it's a really great way to heal the neglect. All sexual violence includes some level of neglect. And there's just no need to neglect yourself in your healing process.
And you mentioned COVID as well, and the lockdown in this incredibly tough year that is just ending as we're recording this. And my first question about that would be, what are people doing now with lockdown to prepare themselves for this kind of work when the work is often harder to find at this point?
Yeah, well, so I think one thing that people are doing, remote ketamine work is still happening. I think there are people who are definitely still trying to access entheogens and psychedelics in some ways. I think some people are doing a lot more solo work. And I think more people are also doing trip sitting with somebody who they're in a pod with. So definitely people are just getting DIY, which I love. But as we're talking about, with severe trauma, maybe being DIY might not be the right way to go. This is just a really hard time. It's a really hard time. There's a lot of not having what people need. And to that, I mean, for people who are listening and they want to be preparing, I think you can start a meditation practice now. You can find a therapist now. And also, I also want to say, being able to access psychotherapy is a privilege, right? Psychotherapy costs a lot of money. And I'm really big into there are so many ways to do healing work that don't cost any money. Meditation is free. Journaling is free. Journaling is actually, I think, a hugely resourceful practice that really helps people to do to do a lot of self-witnessing and self-understanding. So there's a lot of things you could be doing right now. And there's also just this element of having to really accept and grieve reality. Many people need things right now that they do not have. And it's painful. And there's just sort of a question of, can you meet the pain? Can you meet the pain? Can you meet the disappointment? And adapt to it.
I especially appreciate hearing about journaling. I know one of my recovery brothers that I'm close to really swears by journaling for addiction practices. And I know my grandmother believed in things like that very much, in self-witnessing, because one of her great lines was, well, I didn't know what I believed until it came out of my mouth. Which is a Pelger family truth.
I love that. I can just share, I started journaling when I was 10 years old, and I didn't keep a very regular journal for those, probably 10 to 13. But after that, I was so regular in my journaling, and I still journal, and it is so helpful. I actually think it prevents wounding. You kind of got everything that has already happened to you, and then more shit happens. And if you have a journaling practice through it, I think, again, like I was saying earlier, there's a lot of things that determine how traumatic something is. And I just think being able to journal it's like first aid.
So the last thing I wanted to ask was about 2020, because it was such a hell of a year. And I was wondering if you could share any lessons that you brought out of this year for us.
Gosh, Yeah, this year, I definitely feel like I've changed a lot in the year. You can probably tell just by listening to my voice, and if you listen to my podcast, like I'm kind of, I don't know if I'd describe myself as a down to earth person, but more just like I don't. I'm like, just be yourself. Like, just really express yourself. Like get to the point, speak the truth, and like I'm not so invested in sort of posturing in a certain way. And I think this year has just made me feel that even more, especially in my clinical work. Like I think I cared a lot more about what I wore to work when I was going in to see people in person, and now I do work remotely because of COVID. And just even that as an example of something where I'm just like, what matters? That I'm showing up here and I'm listening and we are doing the work. It doesn't really matter whether like I look that professional. And this is sort of a bad example, I guess. But anyway, it just kind of I feel like this year has just made me even more connected to like what really matters, I guess is what I would say. And then also the year, like I'm just like, again, like I'm really big into adapting and accepting reality. And reality is I can't do a lot of the things that I normally do to be well. And so I'm going to find other things to do. And, in the Bay Area where I live, a huge part of the year was wildfires where we couldn't open the windows, we couldn't go outside, and we also couldn't go into other people's houses. So, I mean, we were like stuck in our houses. It's really, really hot heat. The air is toxic. I mean, it was just like, you don't get a lot at that point for what you can do. I remember there was a day where I was like, I need exercise and I want to walk, and I'm going to walk around my home inside until I've tracked on a app that measures it a mile, because I was like, I need to walk a mile today because there's like, I'm not getting any sort of walking in basically. And that might sound a little like bananas to some people. And it's just like, you got to adapt. You've just got to take care of yourself. And so that's like a big just way I've been approaching the year. And if there's any level of encouragement that I can give anyone that's listening, like just take care of yourself. Just get down to what really matters and take care of other people too.
That's great. Thank you. The year of believing in yourself, the year of adapting, and the year of taking care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. Our guest today is Laura Northrup. We'll have links to all of her sites, as well as her podcast, The Inside Eyes, and her social media in the episode notes. Laura, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to share today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Lex. It's been wonderful.
All right, be well. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out pluscbdoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.